Hi, I'm Norman Perlo, a furniture designer maker at Perlo Design and a woodworking educator author at Wood Skills. Hi, in this two-part series I'll be discussing the sharpening system I've been using successfully over a number of years now. I've experimented with different sharpening techniques or systems over the years, and I've come to appreciate the system I use today using a Veal belt sander, which is actually developed as a sharpening system, but it uses a 1-inch by 42-inch belt. Excellent system to create primary grinds on both chisels and plane irons. The water stone system I have to be able to hone the chisels and plane irons I use using different honing guides, and I'll discuss the different honing guides and of how I've come to just use a simple, one of the more recent Veritas model honing guides, or freehand. Most of the time I freehand plane irons and chisels depending on the thickness of the plane iron or chisel to have a good bearing surface. If not, I'll use a guide and all the different water stones I use in a system I've developed. Now, you don't really have to invest in everything here. This is an accumulation of guides over the years. I'll show you how I use this guide for the most part, and the water stone system I have and what water stones to purchase. I won't actually demonstrate any actual sharpening, but you'll understand everything of the techniques and the system I use. So it's a two-part series, and the first part is mostly how to create a primary grind using the Veal belt sander. And the second part of the system is honing the back and the edge of the plane iron or chisel afterwards. So the primary grind is used to establish a bevel. Used when you've accidentally nicked or damaged the leading edge of a chisel or plane iron, or you've purchased a used one and you wish to re-establish a primary grind. Whereas all this is just to continue, once you have the primary grind, it's just to continue sharpening or honing your systems afterwards. So it's a two-part series. I hope you acquire some benefit from what I have to talk about today. Next, I'd like to talk about how I hone the irons, either chisel or plane irons, using a set of water stones. And I have several here that you don't really need this many water stones. I just accumulated a few over the years, and I keep trying to find better water stones. So I'll just give an idea of what I do first. I usually work with a lower grit. If I'm reestablishing or just honing an iron, I'll probably use a 4,000 grit and move up to a 6,000. And this is a 12,000 ceramic stone that I've recently acquired with a holder. I haven't really had an opportunity to use it much. And the important thing with these stones is to keep them flat. They're wet, they're soaked in water, and they need to be, at least the lower grit versions have to be soaked in water. The higher grit versions, like the ceramic stone, only needs a squirt or a slight wetting of the surface to work well. The important thing again is to keep the water stones flat, and I use a flattening stone to do this, to accomplish this. It's a flattening stone I acquired several years ago, and I run it along the surface because you will get dishing in the stones, especially if you're not using it uniformly across when you're either using a guide or you're doing freehand sharpening or honing. So this is more of a general purpose water stone that I like to use. It's a 1200, so this is in the middle, and like after creating a primary grind on my Veal sander, I can just move on to this 1200 grit stone and start honing the either the back or the bevel of the chisel or the plane iron. I normally use freehand sharpening, or honing I should say, freehand honing, because I have thicker irons for my planes, and I have more of a bearing surface on the iron itself. And actually I'll give an example of that. Removing this from the jig I was talking about earlier. So this is an example of a thicker iron, and I'm able to use the bearing surface of the iron. So with practice you can do it this way, but if you're a novice or just starting out, the safer alternative is to use honing guides. And I have 2 or 3. I actually use one much more often than in my other ones now. So I'll give an idea how that works. So again, I've created this tray and I've sealed it with some silicone to keep the water from leaking out, because everything does get wet when you're honing with water stones. And if you haven't heard that before, you'll quickly find out. So this is my my container of water where I soak the stones in, and I'm not going to do any of this. I'm not going to actually do it, but I normally just soak them in there, leave them in, at least the 2 or 3 stones that I'm going to be using when I'm in my honing operation. So I'm not using this today, and I'm not using this today. There are different types of stones. You can get stones with a single grit, like this one with a built-in stand, or you can get this type where you can flip it over and you have two, 1,000 and a 6,000 surface. And this is a cheaper or less expensive alternative. And this is another version of I think a 250 or 1,000 grit stone. So that's the 250 and that's the 1,000 grit. This is another lower cost alternative to instead of acquiring, if you're starting out, acquiring 2 separate stones. So this is good to start with. The 250 is good for even establishing a primary grind, and then move on to 1,000, and then move on to perhaps a higher one, a 4,000, and you should be fine. Keep it very simple. Try to purchase as few sharpening jigs or guides, honing guides and stones initially, and just use them and become familiar with them. You'll notice I have quite a few guides here. This is a side clamping guide, one of my more recent acquisitions, and I like this a lot. I just actually oiled it and lubricated it. And this is one of the original Veritas honing guide systems. This is how you establish the angle, and with this guide, and I'll give a demonstration of that. This is probably the earliest honing guide in existence. This model, it's an Eclipse honing guide, and they come in different variations, but it's as simple as you can get. It's a single wheel. You know, people have used this for years successfully. They're very inexpensive at $25, $30 or so, and just keep them in shape. And it locks in either a plane iron at a predetermined angle. So you establish the angle. So once you've established the angle, you just move on to the actual water stone and use the different grits, and once it's locked in. So this works really well, at least this one. I've had to make some small improvements to it. I'll just put aside. This is, again, this other system that I use. This actually, this is how the Eclipse one works. So this wheel rides along the surface of the stone, and once you've established the angle, it's just a matter of going back and forth and try to create a pattern so you're using as much of the stone as possible, so you have even wear, uniform wear along the surface, and sometimes rotate the actual stone. So that's what I use. So again, I've progressed from this guide to this guide, and then this is my most recent guide. And this works with both chisels and plane irons. And what I like about this particular guide, it's one of Veritas's more recent designs. It's called a side clamping guide. And what I like about this is using this chart, you can set up. You can actually determine the angle. So if so typically it's 25 degrees. So I've set it for 25 there. And because I'm using the upper part of the guide, you can see the 25 upper location. Just move this back so you can see I've lined it up at the 25 on the upper location. Tighten it down. So if I'm using this guide and its upper track, and it's already established at 25 degrees upper location, I don't normally use the lower location, and then I just bring it so it's already a predetermined set to 25 degrees, which is normally what I hone my plane irons and even my chisels at now. So this just again going back and forth along the surface of the water stone, depending on the grit you're using. Sometimes flip it over. Just a consideration is to keep your honing uniform along the stone so you wear it out evenly, and then every 3 or 4 sharpenings use the flattening stone to flatten it again. I do have a flattening stone for this size, I also have a smaller flattening stone for smaller stones, but I could use it on this also. So that's my sharpening system, and I progress again through 250, 1000, 4000, and 6000, and I think that's 10 or 12,000. I haven't used that much yet. And again, these water stones need to be either dunked in water for a while, or on the higher grit ones, you just need to squirt some water on. So that's what I use for sharpening. And so I really like this system because it's easier for me to determine an angle. But again, I've used different systems. And so I'll just show you how to set this up for a chisel. It's very versatile for both chisels and plane irons. Setting it up for 25 now in the upper track, and it's they call it upper location. So that's set. It's locked in at 25. So if I run it along the stone, I'll just pick this stone, a 4000 grit stone, and it's the actual angle is already established at 25 degrees. So it's very easy. And if you do intend to use a honing guide, this is probably the easiest system. Again, try to go across uniformly, create a pattern, a figure 8 pattern, or work across especially the edges. That's where it is least likely to get wear. You can almost tell the wear it's a little dished now. It needs to be flattened. And going across, starting with the lower grit and moving up from 4 to 8,000 grit, and then possibly 12. But again, that's totally optional. I think if you're at 4 or 6, you're fine. Now also, you need to flatten the back a little. Remove a burr. Every time you sharpen the bevel, you create a burr along the edge. It's called a wire edge, and you need to flatten the back or remove that burr, especially when you're progressing to different grit stones. So I normally go maybe an inch in and then flatten the back a little. Not too much, just enough, a few passes to remove that wire edge, that burr, and then continue again with the bevel part. So that's a system I use, and I've been using it successfully now for quite a while. And it also works well with Japanese chisels, which I've started to use in the last year or so. And these chisels they're not really designed to be sharpened with a hollow grind, so it works really well using a Veal sander and these stones. And again, the back is a little easier to flatten because it has a built-in hollow, and that's another subject in itself on how to use the advantages of some Japanese chisels over Western chisels sometimes. So that's the system I use. And here's another. That's a Richard Kell guide that I acquired a long time ago. I just don't use much. So the concept again is to have it's more of a chisel honing guide. It's as simple as it can get. Now the advantage to this one, it has 2 wheels, so it's easier to keep balance, and it's totally optional. It's very expensive, I found at the time, and I really haven't used it much. So the system I used to use is this Veritas system, and you can determine the angle. You can determine the honing angle just from there's a set of numbers here, or standard angles, sharpening or honing angles. So let's say 25 degrees, to rotate that to 25, and then set this within its guide, and just adjust it. So that's just an idea of how it works. So once you've established the angle within the guide at 25 degrees, you would then lock this in and begin honing at that angle. Again, using that same concept. There's the steps I've just detailed on progressing through the stones. So you have this option of guide with this other part. This actually comes as a set, so you can actually determine the angle. Or the more recent version, this is a side clamping guide, and you can do the same thing using this chart to establish 25. You can also, by retracting the blade just a little, set a micro bevel Not sure if everybody's familiar with a micro bevel, so I just set it to about 26 degrees and lock it in. And now if I hone it now, I have a preset micro bevel at 26 degrees. And the original bevel's at 25 to 26. So that's, if you plan on introducing micro bevels into your plane irons and chisels, not necessary. I don't often do it, but I do on occasion. It just saves time when you're honing the blade afterwards. So this is the system I've used successfully for quite a number of years, and I have a couple of very inexpensive $1 a piece water bottles to be able to squirt the stones as I'm honing, to keep them lubricated and to remove the waste. And this is my my very inexpensive container for water that needs to be replaced. Plastic's decomposing. It's so old. It's about 15 to 20 years old. And again, these stones, you can get 2 or 3 stones, very inexpensive stones, or this is a more expensive ceramic stone. But these are typical Japanese water stones. These two have served me well for a long number of years. They're king stones. If you need to invest in a honing guide, just purchase one and get familiar with it. The side clamping ones is my go-to honing guide now. Once you become familiar with the honing process, you'll become more, and using thicker irons or plane irons or chisels, you'll become more familiar with freehand honing, where you don't use a guide at all. And this is done this way. So I normally just run it just using a finger pressure and using the actual bevel itself as a bearing surface along the stone. It's a little tricky, and I would not advise it if you're just a beginner at sharpening, and just run it along. And so this saves the whole time of setting it up in the honing guide. But again, there's always a risk of rounding an edge or rounding the bevel if you're not doing it correctly, and then you'll have to reestablish the primary grind again. So I do it occasionally, but I also use guides now, especially this guide because I like to use it. So that's it's another subject in itself, the subject of freehand honing. Now, some people will complete believers in freehand honing, and they dismiss any sharpening or honing guides completely, but they serve a good purpose, the honing guides. They you need to do this correctly and have your angles established, bevels I should say, at 25 or 30 degrees. So try to keep everything simple. Purchase as few of these items as possible initially, and just practice, even purchasing lower cost stones. So you can, if you do damage them, or you can always replace them, and then do not invest in any high-end or expensive ceramic stones if you're starting out. Just purchase the basic water stones, and it should do you well. And again, the most simple side clamping guide, or this system. This is a precision honing guide from Veritas. It's one of their original ones, or if necessary, just invest in a small. If you don't have any funds for this, just get an Eclipse guide. They're $25 to $30. And the VL sander, as I was describing, is again a $300 to $350 purchase with the motor, and that will establish your primary grinds. So I think in all, you'll spend a few $100s on this, but this should get you going. And I hope I've described my keep it simple sharpening system today. Over the years, I've experimented quite a bit with sharpening and honing, and I realized that you need to keep it simple to be able to want to do it more often, to motivate you to sharpen your tools more often. And you can't really do any hand tool woodworking with dull tools. So that would be it. So please subscribe to my YouTube woodworking channel, where I share more of my woodworking techniques, my woodworking philosophy, my thoughts on woodworking, and all the challenges I've experienced. And I introduce some of the new forms of woodworking I've discovered. And also visit woodskills.com, where I have a good selection of my books, both in print and digital format, on woodworking, and all my online courses, and I also offer some woodworking plans. I have maintained a regular blog on what I've got going on in my workshop and in woodworking in general. So enjoy.